So with that, I want to invite Jasmine up on stage and to talk about building a case for empathy. Welcome, Jasmine.
Thanks. So if you can bear with me, I don't have a clicker here, so I'm going to be doing a lot of this throughout the presentation. So with that, so my name's Jasmine. I am a qualitative researcher and interactive designer. I come to you most recently from the University of Michigan, where I was studying information science. So I recently became involved with IXDA, and I started this campaign called 29 Days of Empathy on Twitter. And so with that, we've been trying to explore what's going on with empathy in the industry. What does it mean? What are people doing to implement it in their businesses? And what's going on in Atlanta specifically around the question of empathy? So I invite you to follow on Twitter or, follow along with the conversation. So I just want a quick show of hands. I'll run down the list. What do you call people who use your product or service? Who uses customer? Okay, what about consumer? User? End user? People? Something else? Folks? Clients, okay. All right. So I asked this question because I want to point out that language is important. When we're talking about empathy, often it comes back to language, and it's sort of the root of how we communicate about this, whether we're talking about the people we're designing for, whether we're talking to people we're designing for, or whether we're talking to other people within our organization about what we're doing. So I want to introduce you to Steve. So Steve used to be the head developer at this small edtech startup here in Atlanta. And recently, they've been growing a lot, so he is now partnering with Michelle, his colleague, and they're going to lead a new team. They're bringing on a bunch of new people in the next few weeks, including UX designers, junior developers, some visual designers. And they're trying to figure out how they're going to split up the roles and what sort of tasks people are going to be doing on a daily basis. So Michelle is really excited because she recognizes that this is their chance. Finally, they can get involved in some user research. She's been talking about this empathy concept a little bit. Now, Steve says, yeah, I'm all about the user research. That sounds great. I'm not really sure how we're going to do it yet. And empathy, I'm not really sold on yet. So he looks it up in the dictionary. If you ask Merriam-Webster, you'll find out that empathy is really about your ability to share other people's feelings and share their experiences and emotions. So notice that it's not really about their thoughts or their words necessarily. It's something much more internal than that. And if we're talking about design, then we're thinking about a process and an approach that people are taking to create products that are adaptable for their very different needs of users. So Steve reached out to me on Twitter the other day. This is based on a real conversation, but not a real person. So he reached out to me on Twitter, and he says, yeah, we use customer profiles. We get into the shoes of our customers that way. We just kind of go with our gut, and then we tweak it with A/B testing. So this brings up an important point. While that is absolutely a valid way to do research and to think about how you're designing for people, I want everyone to think a little bit about how talking and thinking about users, if you're looking purely at quantitative data or market research, it's never the same thing as getting out into the field with them. It's a totally different thing when you're actually out experiencing their problems and experiencing their day-to-day life and work with them. So I bring this up because Steve is biased. Steve is biased just like all of us. We all have a bunch of cognitive biases. Maybe some of you have seen this. There was a Business Insider article going around lately about 20 cognitive biases. And beyond that, we all have facets of our identity that cause us to be biased. Steve is male. Steve is black. Steve is heterosexual. Steve is cisgendered. He is middle class. He has parents who are lawyers. He's college educated. And all of these facets of his identity have an effect on how he sees the world and how he sees these design problems that are coming up in his work. And it's going to be very, very different from the way that other people with very, very different backgrounds are going to see problems in a lot of cases. So we just need to recognize that everyone has these biases. That doesn't necessarily mean that biases are the end of the world or that every day we need to spend a bunch of time trying to figure out how to completely eliminate them. But it is important to recognize them and to at least acknowledge that they exist, especially when you're thinking about your customers and what you're designing for them. So we continued the conversation a little bit. I wanted to say, hey, Steve, you should totally think about doing some user research. It's great. You can, root your decisions in data rather than just assumptions, and it can save you a lot of time and money. So he wanted to know, what kinds of things can we do? So to me, Steve is asking, people are talking about empathy, I get it. It seems really important, but how are they actually incorporating it into their businesses? That's still not clear. So there's a lot of common methods that people are already using that build a lot of empathy. That can include usability testing, interviews, focus groups, card sorting. Let's think about some other ways we could go beyond that. This is an example of sort of, I want to call it an enhanced interview. So I've done things in the past where I've sort of split interview sessions into two parts, where part of it is typical semi-structured interview style, and the other part is bringing in an actual artifact, whether that's a paper prototype or something else, and working through some tasks a little more usely than a usability test, but really getting direct feedback from the end user. I can't stress enough how important observation is and getting out into the field with users. Now, this is obviously a bit of an extreme example in terms of the sort of resources and infrastructure that people are dealing with compared to some of the solutions that many of you may be designing. But it really illustrates the fact that sitting at a desk in a high-rise, looking at a computer screen, there's no way that you can properly empathize with groups that are out in the world living in totally different situations. Another way is to just get the stakeholders involved. This is an example of a social work organization that we were helping design a logo for, and part of the process was a small design jam where we were, playing with paper prototypes and showing them, hey, these are the ideas people have, but look what it would look like if you put it on a shirt or a hat. And it really gets people involved, and they enjoy it, and they feel like they have a say, like they have a voice in the process. This is another example. It's called cultural probes. So basically, you take a packet and you stuff it with a bunch of stuff that you want people to fill out over a period of time, often 3-4 weeks or more. So you might include maps or questions or a notebook or a camera with specific instructions. Just another way you could think about doing it. Obviously, a lot of people have constraints, so I highly recommend thinking about guerrilla research at least, whether that's sticking things up in a public space or grabbing people on the street to ask them a single question. You can hold something like a design jam, even at your office, and get ideas from other people in your organization. And again, I can't stress enough how important doing at least some form of observation or shadowing can be to building empathy. It's really all about learning to listen and just giving your users a voice. So now that we have all these insights, so Steve's starting to get a better picture. Okay, I see how we could do this realistically, but what do we do with all that information then? So the most important thing is that insights are only useful to those people who know about them. I think Aaron touched on this a little bit earlier. You can't build a culture around empathy unless everyone involved in making these products, whatever side they're coming from, unless they can really empathize with the users and know about what's going on. So you might use reports, graphics, personas, standard things, but you can think about other ways to do these things. These are examples of personas, which are very commonly used, but they're done in a totally different way, where they're really eye-catching and they're posted all over the office. These are from MailChimp. So this is a great way. Think about using really interesting models or frameworks. This comes from Think Interactive and Michelle Berryman. It's about cadence, the intensity and duration and length of experiences through different channels that people are having with your product. This is really eye-catching, and it makes people want to pay attention to the information. This is a picture representing this thing called game film that Full Story does. Basically, what they do is they sit down as a group and they watch video from tests of people clicking through websites. And they keep track of how many times people are visibly wincing at something bad happening or at wins when something really good is happening. And then at the end, they tally things up and look at how many winces were happening, basically. And I also want to stress that empathy doesn't always have to be about talking and seeing things. You can channel emotions through other venues and other ways as well. I think Yik Yak does a really good job of this. They're mostly targeted at college campuses, and they have an awesome SoundCloud channel where basically it's a bunch of playlists that are geared towards college students when they're studying. But if I'm trying to really get in the mindset of a college student, I might sit down and I might put on one of these playlists while I'm designing and try and really think like a college student. So what it comes down to is that people want your offering to adapt to them, not the other way around. I think nowadays we have so many options that it's so easy for people to just stop and move on to the next thing if what you've created for them just isn't addressing their needs in the right way. So if you can create a culture where everyone in your organization that's responsible for helping build these products has a really good sense of the problems you're solving and the people you're solving the problems for, then you really can create better solutions. So we have these keys. We have language is important. Again, it's just something you need to be intentional and thoughtful about. Talking and thinking about users is never the same as getting out into the field with them. I highly recommend doing some observations at any point that you can. Everyone has implicit biases. Again, we just need to recognize that. Learn to listen well and give people a voice. And people want your offering to adapt to them, not the other way around. So going back to Steve, Steve's come up with a plan now. So he says, you know what, I have some ideas. I think we can do this. So I want to start by saying, let's call people learners instead of customers. We're an ed tech company. Everyone that's using our product are students. That seems like a good way to start. We're going to make all of our team members shadow users, and then they're going to have to report back. We'll do some onboard training. Michelle, my partner, will talk to them about biases and listening well. And all of our team members are going to have to provide support. When we first roll out our new products when they get here, we're going to make them take customer support calls and talk to the customers to see what problems are out there. And we'll also make sure that knowledge and insights are going to be shared in a lot of ways. So go get them, Steve. So I'd love to continue this conversation. Again, you can find me on the internet, IXDA Atlanta. I also recommend checking them out. Yeah, so that's it.
Yeah, and we have 5 minutes for questions. We have 5 minutes if anybody has questions for Jasmine. What?
No questions.
So I have a
This-
question.
This guy.
I was a little bit curious if you could go in depth with the, I think it says cultural probes.
Cultural probes, yeah. Could you go back to that slide? Is that possible? It's the last, it's with all the papers spread out. So cultural probes, it's a method you can use. It's back a couple more. That. So it's basically a method you can use. It's sort of like doing ethnographic work from afar. So basically what you do is you come up with a package of resources that you're going to send out to a group of people, your end users, and you can put a number of different things in there. So this picture, I'll just run through what's here. This is a series of different questions that are specifically related to the product we're looking at designing. This is a camera with specific prompts about things that people are encountering in their everyday lives that you're asking them to take pictures of, whether it's their desk at work or where they park their bike or what their office at home looks like. It sort of depends on what you're designing for. There's other things on here like a word cloud, like what words do you use to describe this particular thing? I have a family tree, I have a map of campus, we've got a little notebook where people can keep track of whatever things you want them to. So it's just sort of a way to send things out, and then you can either have people send them back all together after a few weeks or even a few months in some cases, or have them send them back as they fill them out. Sometimes people will use postcards, and they'll give people a packet of postcards, each with a specific question, and they'll just send them back as they fill them out. So it's just a way, like I said, it's kind of like doing ethnographic work from afar and letting the users themselves determine what they want you to know about these particular things.
Anybody else?
Okay.